Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and today's episode is all about ESG. 1 year ago, the media was full of stories about companies retreating from environmental, social and governance as Trump came to power. But how widespread was the retreat really, and what can we expect this year? Here to discuss ESG in 2026 is Sarita Shah, Senior Vice President at Weber Shandwick, and Sarah Ogden, Chief Client Officer for Europe at Zeno Group. Hello both, thanks for coming on board.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure. Firstly, it was a couple of weeks ago now, but you were both at Davos this year. What were your overall impressions a few weeks on? Did you get a sense that we're in this new world order that Mark Carney famously described? What are your thoughts at this stage? Sarita, let's go first.
So I thought this year's Davos was super interesting. It felt to me like a bit of a tale of two Davoses. I think you had the big geopolitical conversations that were happening that you describe, and certainly it felt very American compared to kind of years past. It was a really strong American presence on the promenade. But I think kind of underlying all of that, there was a lot of business as usual as well. Like there were lots of kind of global decision makers coming together, having meetings that they've set out in their agenda for the year, which made for a really interesting dynamic. Maybe the second point on this year's Davos was the shift in AI. In years past, we've had houses upon houses of AI-focused companies and conversation on the promenade. And this year, there was definitely a shift to really focus on deployment. AI was infused into all the conversations rather than being kind of a standalone frontier technology would be my two main observations, I think.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And Sarah?
Well, what an extraordinary Davos. We kind of forget how unique that experience is in many, many ways. And I think, I don't know how long you were there for, but I think I was there for 5 or 6 days. You're talking for anyone who's trodden the halls of any conference centre or exhibition or major meeting moment for businesses, that's an intense amount of hours and time and focus to give anything. That's day and night and then across, as I said, those 5 days. So I think it's an extraordinary event. I think the content that they produce is covering everything from what happens within the actual forum to what's happening on the periphery. I think the media houses this year, the presence was huge and significant. I think it really was an extraordinary Davos. And in terms of, I guess, the new world order, well, I mean, it was just sort of like living in some crazy bubble, seeing things unfold in real time, hearing from people on the ground who, are in the rooms and experiencing it behind the scenes. It was everything and more, I think, from those who didn't attend. Really gave us a lot to think about.
Yeah, I bet. And do you have any sort of immediate thoughts on how your roles might be affected by this dawning of the new world order, as Carney put it? Are there more calls for certain types of counsel in this turbulent time, or any other ways in which client priorities are really clearly changing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the reality is, I think, as we all know, is that change happens in a kind of multi-layered fits and starts kind of way. I don't think Davos was particularly a moment where something jumped out of the box and announced its arrival. I think everybody knew that the signs and the signals were well and truly established in terms of how things were changing, how alliances were shifting, where power was or wasn't. I think, the interesting thing about Davos is that it is about a kind of display of power, who has it, who brokers it, and what are the forces at play and what are the intentions behind it. So I think it's an exciting and very interesting zeitgeist moment for us to kind of unpack. And I think some of the leaders, and I think you reference the excellent Mark Carney speech, not just excellent in terms of its substance and I think what many, many people in the world needed to hear, but also just in terms of its best in class, the way it was written, the way as students and scholars as we all are of storytelling and of scripts and of how to build narratives and to deliver them in an excellent fashion. That speech demonstrated the art and science in an A-class category. So it was well worth unpacking and watching over and over again.
Yeah, it was extraordinarily good, wasn't it? And Sarita, on to you when it comes to sort of the changes brought about by this era. And yeah, you're right, Sarah, not just because of Davos, but it felt like a sort of moment to reflect on it. What have you seen as the biggest changes in terms of what clients are looking for and the big differences, really?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, John. I mean, I think in many ways, Davos is a microcosm of like the work we do more broadly as corporate affairs professionals. And I think this year we're seeing at Weber kind of a few different changes and really priority focus areas. I think one is connections and cultural fluency, you know, really understanding the people that you need to know and those unhidden gems that really allow a brand story to resonate. And I think that's the stuff that kind of operates outside of the realms of LLMs and AI, you know, the things that are really distinctly human. So definitely a really strong focus on that. Combined with that, I think still interest and curiosity in AI, and particularly I think when it comes to capacity building, there's lots of things AI can't do, but one of the things it really can do is help us free up time to work on the things that do make us distinctly human. And there's lots of focus and curiosity, I think, from clients on how we can really work with them to build capacity within their teams. And then maybe the third piece is much more focused on kind of community and how you're tapping into new communities and really advising on quite a dynamic timescale, really. Lots of our clients are working into CEOs on geopolitical matters, fast evolving conversations, community discussions that are changing at the flick of a button. So really being able to provide that dynamic counsel at a senior level with deep expertise is proving really important this year.
Brilliant stuff. Well, I want to talk about ESG now, the main thrust of this podcast. You know, to what extent did the corporate world really retreat from ESG in 2025, in your view? Was it slightly overhyped, or has there been a really big change? What do you think?
So my view is there's probably been a retreat in ESG when it comes to language rather than action. Like, there's no doubt that the landscape has changed. And I think what we're now really seeing is probably a separation of the wheat from the chaff. I think the discussion and the language around ESG for a long time allowed brands to make quite performative claims that perhaps they had intentions to deliver on, perhaps they didn't, but really bold claims, whilst other businesses were really quietly chugging along, making progress and kind of really embedding sustainable practices into their value chains and into their organizations. And I think now the inflection point that we're at is seeing a bit of a divergence emerge, really. And the businesses that are really winning out when it comes to sustainability are those that have kind of embedded those practices in, because it allows them to quite authentically speak to the people who care about sustainable, resilient, long-term business in the language that matters to them. I think maybe one other thing is there's no doubt that businesses are having to negotiate serving the priorities and the national priorities of the kind of the organizations and governments that they serve, but they're also having to meet the expectations of their investor groups, of their employees, of their direct customers, many of whom continue to care about environmental practices and long-term business success. So I think definitely we're seeing businesses continue to invest in really interesting environmental policies, but certainly there's a change in how they talk about that going forward, I think.
Fascinating. Have you seen similar?
Exactly that, you know, not a retreat of responsibility, but a retreat of rhetoric. But I do think what is really interesting, to sort of unpack it further, is obviously the geographical nuance to this. I think the brand of ESG itself is going through a period and it's going through a maturing. I think one of the biggest challenges you've got with ESG is that you've got three very different elements. And yes, there's a relationship between them all, but they are quite different. And I think the context that we're in today is really bringing that difference to bear. And the environment, from a measurement point of view, is easier to do. It's much easier to track the performance of corporations against measurement goals and targets. And when it comes to social, that's much more political. And when we're in the world that we're in right now, which is much more fragmented and divisive in many ways, then that's a much harder thing to manage, both as an organisation, but also in terms of trying to move things forward in the right way. And I think, you know, just echoing again what you've said, when you think about this from a kind of US, Europe, APAC point of view, I think it's clear to see in Europe a significant hardening of focus on ESG and a doubling down on those responsibilities, partly driven by the policy environment. This is much more about risk and management and governance. Obviously in the US, we're seeing much more of a focus on some of the challenges that come with the S part of that, and also organisations being put under increasing scrutiny and pressure with regards to performance against some of those things in a public sense. But again, I think there's a lot of global businesses that are quietly behind the scenes continuing on the path that they were already on.
Yeah, I remember maybe a year or so ago, the term ESG hushing started to sort of rear its head, and DEI hushing as well, kind of links thing. Do you think we're definitely seeing that?
I think the age of performative ESG behaviours is definitely in decline, if not massively diminished / gone, and thank God for that, right? And I think actually even when you look at within corporations and organisations, how ESG has shifted from being much more like about, activism and campaigning and narratives, and much more now about kind of governance, risk, finance, and it's much more a kind of business sustainability focus than it is a performative, how do we show up as brands and businesses to our stakeholders. It's much more about business and managing the challenges that many organisations face.
Do you think it's more measurable now? I've just thought of this off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of the sort of social stuff seemed to be a kind of image, like, for want of a better term, a sort of vibe thing, that rainbow Twitter handles and all of this sort of stuff that had a lot of attention. Do you think now it's about, okay, we're really only going to focus on like your sustainability targets in numbers and maybe stats around having a more diverse workforce or whatever it might be? I think we've got to that stage where it is more about the numbers than the overall vibe, for want of a better term.
I think actually, just as a point of clarity, when I refer to performative, marketing or ESG behaviours, that's not about organisations who visibly and publicly take a stand on the values or the human behaviours that they want to respect and reward and recognise. I don't think businesses affiliate themselves with pride is necessarily performative, and it's way too catch-all to suggest it is. I think those things are incredibly important and incredibly valuable. So I just sort of put that aside. I think the point I was making about performative use of ESG is organisations who perhaps might invest more time and attention in how they're seen versus what they do. And I think we're in a world where, proof and transparency is, to your point in terms of the context we're in, as great as it's ever been. It's very hard to get away with not putting your money where your mouth is. And I think, yes, certainly in the European Union, there is now a lot of things like even like, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, organisations now are policy driven to report and be transparent and prove their commitments with hard evidence. And so that is only going to continue, I think, and it's really great and important.
Great. And what are your thoughts on this, Sarita? Do you have any, obviously a lot going on there, I guess, on the point about targets and more measurable elements of ESG, do you feel that has been emphasised more in recent times?
What I'd say is there's a really clear focus on outcomes, and I think that matters, and kind of following through on what you say you're going to do is really critical. And I think that comes back to being aligned with your core values as a business, and then how you set out how you measure success. I don't think it's necessarily about numbers or metrics that may not actually have substance. I think it's about looking clearly at what matters to what stakeholder in your organization and then delivering against that. For some, it will be your investors. It may be how does sustainability ladder up to long-term financial resilience. For your employees, it may be more important that you're looking at specific initiatives that make you feel inclusive and welcome as an employee. So I don't think it's as binary as numbers matter more now than they used to, but I think certainly, exactly as Sarah said, proof in the pudding, definitely kind of following through on what you're going to say matters more and more and more.
Interesting, yeah. And going back to the point about geography that you mentioned, Sarah, I thought that was really interesting. Do you agree with that as well? I mean, I've heard a few agency leaders talk about how ESG is just seen in a different light in Europe and maybe other places. And the US is, I wouldn't say just doing its own thing, because clearly what happens in the US has many ripples across the world. But do you feel there is a different approach to ESG in Europe?
I think exactly as Sarah said, it's much more policy driven in the European Union, and that's critical when you think about things on a global stage. Businesses and organisations have to have an element of kind of consistency, and again, that comes back to values. What is it that you're standing for, and how can you follow through naturally within the constructs of the geographies that you're operating within? But I think certainly in Europe, there is certainly a real focus on policy driven accountability, which can only be a positive thing.
Zeno did a roundtable in Paris last year in partnership with Page Society, and we had quite a lot of European, some Americans living in Europe, comms leaders, and this was a very hot topic at the time actually about ESG. And just to your point about kind of European organisations and businesses that are founded in Europe and are 100 years old, and culturally, where do they sit on ESG? And I think it's just a really good moment to sort of remind ourselves that just because we've got an acronym for something doesn't mean that it only existed within the boundaries because of the invention of that acronym. And actually, you know, there are so many, as we all know, amazing examples of businesses that have demonstrated phenomenal kind of environmental governance and responsibility. And in fact, that's often the inception of what those businesses are born out of. Similarly, from a social point of view, you know, even in the UK, going back to the days of Cadbury's and others, the social contract between an employee and the workforce wasn't just an invention during ESG. I think that's something that business leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, change makers for hundreds and hundreds of years have recognised that there is value and equity in looking after the people and the environment that you operate in, and also upholding good transparency around governance. I mean, these are just good basic human principles of running a business.
There is a point in that as well, isn't there, in terms of kind of when you think about maybe the changing in the global consensus, and actually ES and G are all being treated very differently, and both in different markets, but also within different groups in society as well. And if you think about what matters to each of those groups, they're not necessarily always coherent and consistent. And that's something that we have to be mindful of as communicators as well.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question. Do you think the term ESG might get phased out, or is getting phased out? I wondered if it might be kind of replaced with the word impact, which seemed to become the sort of popular word to use maybe in the last, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years or so? Or do you think actually it suits its purpose and I'm overthinking it?
I think you could probably get really nerdy and go down a wormhole about like the value of words.
That's
and
what
semantics.
this podcast is for, Sarah. This is what we do. This is who we are.
In which case, I'm all in. I'm all in. Well, I would say, you know, it's important, isn't it, that we have constructs and that we put things neatly into constructed swim lanes, and then we can see them and then we can understand them in that context from which we're like looking at them. So I think the value of having ESG broken down in the way it is, as we've said, because all those three elements are very different, but they have a very important relationship with each other. I think going back to the point you were probably making around, you know, there's been an evolution and a sophistication globally about how we think about this, about how these things factor into businesses and business management and operations and reporting, and then obviously the policy context. So it is important. I don't think ESG and what that acronym is trying to do is the same as the word impact. I think ESG is about behaviour and impact is about an outcome from that behaviour. So I think it's really important that we don't become really woolly, because impact is also subjective. Your impact is not mine, and probably an American company's impact might not be the same as an Asian company. So, you know, again, I think the more specific and literal we can be in terms of what we're talking about and the language that we use, and to have the universal as much as we can understanding of that language, then that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, if you come back to why the phrase ESG was created is quite a helpful starting point. Like ultimately it was designed to be an organizational framework that could be embedded into companies and ultimately folded into their kind of ongoing corporate practices. It wasn't designed as a communications term. It wasn't designed as something that marketers could kind of hang their hats on. And I think if you look at it through the lens of ESG being about creating long-term sustainable businesses, then yeah, I completely agree. I don't think it's synonymous with impact, but it can be maybe viewed through the lens of what is the impact that we're trying to create, and how do you fold that into long-term business practices.
So the question is really, what does language do when it's used well? A bit like a good narrative, is it? I guess it organises and aligns, right? It brings us together in a common meaning, and therefore in the common meaning we can work out how we all behave and act in the pursuit of that thing. So I think in that sense, I guess it is a communications endeavour, but it's possibly not an external marketing. I guess to your point, wasn't invented as an external marketing.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. And here's a question, it's kind of linked to what you were saying, actually. You know, obviously we're the comms industry and public affairs and so on. We sort of see this as our domain. This is something that we have a very strong handle on. But maybe that's because we and I perhaps are sort of obviously centred in this sector. Do you think comms does, inverted commas, own ESG? And do you think it should? Or which other departments do you think have a really strong say over ESG policies?
I don't think communications owns ESG. But I do think when things are, particularly in corporate culture, when they're new and it's an early phase of the zeitgeist moment, as it were, in terms of people becoming familiar with something, it tends to live in communications, because we're not just people with broadcast focus. We are the sense makers for many organisations. We talk about Zeno, meaning based on the Greek god, which talked about you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, which means you should listen.
Is that where the name comes from?
It is, yeah. You should listen twice as hard as you speak. And I think that's an excellent lesson for us as an industry, and one that I do try my very best, but not in a podcast, to go with. And I think we are, for very large organisations, as external agencies, often there as those the kind of outside in perspective, and our job is as much about sense making and helping organisations understand things. And I think when our ESG has been very new and very formative, there's a big need for organisations to make sense of that. What does it mean for them? What does it mean for their stakeholders? How should it impact the way that they communicate and engage? However, I think the world has moved on significantly, and I think ESG is now, as I said earlier, so deeply entrenched in business operations, risk management, workforce, stability, resilience, supply chain. It's gone way beyond a communications job. It's very much about business and opportunity and growth.
ESG is not the responsibility of communications, and particularly the E part of ESG surely. Has to live and breathe across an entire organisation, because ultimately it's about securing your long-term future as a business. If you're a commodities business, if you're an FMCG business, if you're a clothing business, actually operating within planetary boundaries, or whatever we want to call it, it is critical for your business's long-term existence. It's an existential problem, which means it does have to live within your finance team's focus, within your operations team, within your legal teams, and also even within your insurance team's focus. How can they secure those assets over the long term? So I think very much the E of ESG has had to move out of the framework of a communications function, and all for the better, really.
Yeah, and yet communications is crucial for it, right? You couldn't really have good ESG practices if communications weren't, if not leading, then at least sort of coordinating and selling the message as you'd expect comms to do, and all of that good stuff, and internal comms probably as much as anything, if not more.
Yeah, I think the past 5 years for sustainability communications has been really important. Like, ESG shouldn't just be dismissed, and we shouldn't just go, oh, well, that was woolly, or nobody delivered on their goals. It was a really critical phase in communications, I think. It raised awareness to people who weren't fully aware of the extent of the challenge that we had. It forced governments and leaders into action. So we shouldn't just go, okay, now what's the next thing? But it allowed us to usher in a new phase where ESG, and particularly the sustainability part of ESG, is starting to be folded into kind of business critical operations, and therefore business critical communications.
Yeah. I mean, ESG is fundamental to license to operate. That's where we're at. So, but it's interesting talking about communications, because going back to one of your earlier questions, I do think how we frame what we do is fundamentally changing. I think communications is essential to all aspects of business change, business management, business transformation, being able to react to the environment that you're in a way that is meaningful. That is peak critical right now in the world, in terms of where will the next geopolitical wind take us? What's the next AI innovation around the corner? What is the next social crisis or health scare crisis? We are in a very challenging environment, and the ability to orientate yourself, certainly if you're a global organisation, in real time at scale, is a complex task, and needs specialist support from people who are very professionally able to do that. So I think our industry is in an incredible spot in being able to be the people to call, quite frankly, for many organisations. And that's just not the comms teams, that's departments that are focused on growth, resilience, risk, and how to manage the transformation of a workforce. These are big tasks, and I think communications is the oil in the machine that is absolutely essential to them.
How do you think ESG is being handled within agencies now? I mean, I feel like a little while ago you'd get sort of ESG teams, ESG departments, divisions. I'm not sure we hear so much about that now. I think there's a real sense that ESG just runs through everything. Do you think that's fair? And what have you sort of seen in terms of the structure of how ESG works in your organisations? Is it just, if you're not thinking about ESG, you're probably not as good as you could be in comms, to put it bluntly?
Yeah, I mean, it's business as usual. I'll say as the first thing, it's absolutely essential within corporate teams that everyone has a really deep understanding of the challenges, the opportunities, the technicalities, the policy landscape. I think what we've certainly seen in our teams is a segmentation of that expertise. So whereas you might have had, an ESG or sustainability team all sort of lumped together, what we tend to have now is some individuals who are technical specialists on technical reporting of ESG. We might have some who are technical experts on the policy landscape. That's obviously geographically relevant. We've actually got teams from a creative point of view who are focused and specialist in how do we take this technical, complex, quite frankly, dull issue or opportunity around one of the factors of ESG and actually bring creativity to it and bring it and make it human and bring it to life in a way that people engage with it. So I think all facets of the typical comms agency have a golden line of ESG in what they do, but it's what they ask and what the brief is. And I think having those layers of skills and abilities to approach it, I think is really important.
Yeah, what do you think, Sarita?
Yeah, I think I'd say absolutely, completely agree. Sustainability, I'd say, is a spine that runs through all of the Weber teams at the moment. We look at it certainly from a corporate point of view, but also from a brand behaviour perspective, thinking about how our consumer team is showing up when representing kind of direct-to-consumer comms. Similarly, from an analytics point of view, how are we kind of measuring perception change and understanding what's really going to resonate in order to affect ultimate consumer behaviour. And then I think there's the S piece, which we treat very separately. We have sustainability teams, and then we have people who are much more focused on social impact, change management, inclusion comms. And those are different skill sets. It's not the same. To our point earlier on ESG being 15 different things lumped into one, having kind of a breadth of people who understand all the facets that allow a company to really embrace environmental communications and talk about that story, as well as their inclusion story and engaging their workforce and their investors and keeping that entire kind of matrix happy, has been a really core focus. And I think AI has actually helped us do some of that, uncovering some of those insights which were otherwise hidden, but also a really deep understanding of specific types of sustainability communications and also how those apply to different sectors and industries as well.
Great. Do you think, I started off talking about ESG in 2025 and how it's evolved. I mean, looking very much at what's happened this year so far, are you noticing, as we see some cracks in Donald Trump's approval ratings, do you think corporate America in particular is still as hyper concerned about getting on the wrong side of the president and how that manifests itself with ESG? Do you think things are changing a bit? There's a bit of a shifting of the zeitgeist there, or do you think it's really a continuation of what we were seeing towards the back end of last year?
So I think the US is really interesting when you think about it from blue state versus red state. When you think about local versus national, I think the landscape is actually incredibly nuanced within the US culturally around some of these topics. And obviously I am not corporate America, nor trying to represent it today, so I couldn't possibly fully answer that question. However, based on my experience and the organisations I'm fortunate enough to work with, I would say, going back to what we've talked about today, that there is an ongoing commitment. Things are quieter, let's say, on the ESG front. And I think actually we saw, going back to Davos, a couple of quite big interviews by some CEOs on this topic of American businesses who talked about a dislike of how they are being forced into being quieter, but actually that what they were seeing in reaction to that was their employees effectively kicking off and not being happy that their employers were seemingly retreating. And I think leaders are saying, we're not retreating, we're just quieter on the topic because we have to be, because there are real serious business issues if we're not. Obviously address everybody in the US, but it does seem to me that things are continuing to move in the right direction for society and humanity, but there is certainly less visibility of some of that.
Sarita, do you think the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about the changing landscape in the US and more broadly is that organisations are having to plan for constant volatility, whether or not a government is in favour or not in favour, whether or not a leader is popular or not popular. They're having to adjust and operate within the bounds of constant shifting sands. And I think certainly that's one of the things that I'm experiencing is working with global clients is how do we plan, yes, for the next 6 months, but also for the next 5 years, knowing that volatility is almost going to be a constant. And I know I've said it quite a lot today, but I think it does come back to what are your enduring values as a business and how do you live up to those so that you can hold your head high when you go into town halls and speak to your employees, so that you can justify when you're speaking to investors why you've undertaken decisions. But yeah, naturally, as with any kind of communications, when you're trying to tailor things to different audiences, things will have to dial up and down. But I certainly think the big shift that I'm seeing is a focus on how do we plan for the ever-changing volatility, knowing that that's also kind of pulling through in business operations too. Clients are reshaping their business models to kind of deal with constant change at a global level, and that's kind of then filtering into how communications has to function too.
Great. Well, final question then, and this very much factors into what you're both saying just now, really, but do you have any sort of big predictions for what might happen with ESG for the rest of this year?
So my prediction for ESG this year is that it will continue to be folded into the businesses that deem it really important. It will continue to be a priority because it's a business critical decision. I think from a communications point of view, I think we're going to continue to see probably an evolution of where we've got to over the past 6 months or so, where some businesses are willing to take a quite bold stance on their positions, particularly on the S piece of ESG. But what my hope is that kind of we have more businesses continue to plug away at making the changes that they need to ensure their businesses for the long term and ultimately protect our planet as well. So I think we aren't done away with the principles of ESG, but certainly we'll continue to see an evolution in how we talk about sustainability and social communication.
Okay, Sarah?
You talked about values. One of the things that I spend a lot of time focused on at Zeno is that we've had a piece of IP running for over 15 years now called the Human Project. And we map and track the shifting landscape around values because, as we know, values are a great precursor to behaviour and they are an incredibly valuable way to understand how people are feeling and therefore what they're likely to do. And I think in the context that we've been describing, the changes, the dynamism, the information overload that everybody is now facing, values are moving much more rapidly. How people feel today is going to change to how they may feel tomorrow. And I think that has massive implications for communications and for organisations. I think the added reality is that, as we know, we've now got 6 generations in the workplace. We've got 6 generations of consumers, multiple households. The dynamics of the relationships between different segments in societies is really different. The values of a boomer versus an alpha is extraordinary. And yet on any average day, the alpha is massively influencing the boomer. I can vote for that myself as a focus group of 1. And so I think that in itself as well is an extraordinary reality for us to deal with and also to keep track of. And, the latest data that we're seeing around these different demographic groups and their value systems on the topic of ESG is mind-blowing. So I think the landscape ahead is going to be incredibly bumpy. And I think some of the patterns that we're starting to see that we've talked about, the hardening around environment, the increased fragmentation around the social dimension, I'm sad to say is going to continue, if not accelerate, over the year ahead.
Okay, right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much to Sarita and Sarah for your great insights. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. And thanks, of course, to everyone for listening. Until next time, goodbye.